nirasya sarva sandeham ekikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram namashristam manumapi shachiputramatra swarupam rupam tasyagrajamarupurim maturim goshtavatim radha kundam girivaramaho radhikamadavashyam praptoyasya pratita kripaya shri gurum tam natosmi pancha kalpatarubhyascha kripa sindubhyaiva cha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namah namo mahavaranyaya krishna prema pradayate krishnaya krishna chaitanya namne gaura tvishe namah jayatam surato pango mama mandamate gati matsarvasva parambujo radha madanamohano kuladi devatamar madanamohan jara sevak raghunatha rup sanatan jaya rupa sanatana bhatta raghunath shri jiva gopala bhatta dasa raghunath echai gushai kori charana vandan jaha hoite vignanasha bhishta puran adadanas trinam dantoir yacheham puna puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhyudisam Janma Janmani. So by the grace of Sri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Maha Sagar, Sri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved, dearmost associate, the fulfiller of his heart's desire in this world, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava Charjas, Sri Rupa Goswami Pad. Again today we will continue our discussion of Padyavali. So we're in the section on Bhajana Mahatmya, the greatness of Bhagavad Bhajan. And in our last discussion we read a verse wherein it was stated, or the consequences of neglecting or rejecting bhakti were described, as well as the benefit of performing bhakti. So bhakti is such a virtuous thing that if you perform it, it's as though you've never performed any non-virtuous act. But if you neglect bhakti, it's as though you've performed every unvirtuous act. Bhakti is of such essential nature when perceived from a spiritual or what's called a paramartik perspective. So we went in the commentary, some verses in the Bhagavatam, where it's explained that Bhagavan's worship is compulsory if one seeks moksha, and that Bhagavan is not just able to be worshipped or could be worshipped or can be worshipped, but rather he's so worthy of worship that to neglect to worship him is considered a transgression. So today we'll move to the next verse where this section on Bhajan Mahatmya continues, and the topic is taken up of the extirpation of sin, or rather how bhakti is purifying of the mind is now described. So an anonymous poet describes this as follows: kāṣāyān naca bhojanādi-niyamān no vane vāsato vyākhyānād atha muni-vrata-bharāc cittodbhavaḥ kṣīyate kintu sphīta-kalinda-śaila-tanayā-tīreṣu vikrīḍato govindasya padāravinda-bhajanārambhasya leśād. He says, that which arises in the mind, meaning kāma, is destroyed, neither by wearing saffron cloth, nor by regulation of eating and so forth, nor by living in a forest, nor by exposition, nor by a profusion of sages' rites, but rather by even a slight touch of an undertaking of worship of the lotus feet of Govinda, playing extraordinarily on the bountiful banks of the daughter of Mount Kalinda. So, a contrast is made. Kāma is destroyed by bhakti and not by any other form of jnana or vairagya. Essentially, this is what is being stated in the verse. And examples of such are mentioned. So, let's come to the commentary. The commentator has some nice points and citations in this regard. And first of all, it's insightful to consider the word in the verse for the subject is cittodbhavaḥ, which is a word for kāma. There are other similar words in Sanskrit, like in the Bhagavatam you find the word atma-bhu, or you also find the word manodbhava or manobhu, that which is born in the mind or that which arises in the mind. These are all names for kāma. And as we know, in Sanskrit, many of the names given for things are given according to the intrinsic characteristics or the marginal characteristics of the object that they're being used to name. So we can get some insight into the nature of the object just from the name that the object has. So the commentator cites a verse in Bhagavatam which illustrates the significance of why kāma is called here cittodbhavaḥ, or that which arises in the mind. So what's alluded to by this name is what are called vasanas or samskaras that are embedded in the citta, or here I've given it loosely as mind, but in Bhagavatam's fourfold analysis of the psyche, the citta is often described in English as what you call the subconscious mind, or the hard drive, if you will, where the impressions created by one's past actions are stored in the form of impressions which shape one's thoughts, give rise to one's desires, etc. So, kāma is described as, quote, that which arises in the mind, because kāma is an outcome of the vasanas and samskaras that one has. And when I say these two words together, it's partially redundant, if we, at least in the usage that we see among our Gaudiya acharyas. In some cases, they use the word vasana and samskara synonymously. But if we have to make a distinction between them, then we can say that vasanas are like something that emerge from samskaras, in that if you take samskaras as the impressions created by actions, and then vasanas as the inclinations that emerge from the presence of those impressions, we can get some utility out of both terms. But as we'll see here in the commentary of Sridhar Swami on the verse we'll discuss, he also refers to them synonymously. So the point is that kāma, or this experience of desire, is a complex entity. In other words, it's not just one thing, but a desire emerges when an object is perceived and one has the samskaras and vasana already programmed into one's psyche, such that when one sees that object, this thing called kāma arises. Just as we might travel to a new place, we might see some strange looking food in this new place we've never been to, and if we see this food, we might not feel the desire to eat it. We might even say, oh my gosh, what is this? We might feel some hesitation or even some aversion. But perhaps if we have some persuasive friends or other circumstances happen and we try the food and it turns out to be good, then when we look at that same food again the next day, we have a very different experience in our mind. Now we have the experiences of, oh, let me have this again today. So the same object, when we perceived it after we had a samskara for it, now the mind is experiencing a desire for that object. But when we didn't have the samskara related to it, when it was just in the unidentified category, then no desire arose to partake of it. So it's just a simplistic example to illustrate how desire arises both from perception of an object and from the existing conditioning that the psyche has. So the example I gave is related to a specific object, but more broadly, when we talk about a vasana, we can talk about the inclination we have for, let's say, eating in general, or particular activities in general, etc. So the point then, or one of the main things that's being stressed in this verse, is that if you want to remove kāma from the mind, you're not going to do it until you remove the vasanas that are in the psyche. Because kāma may not arise in the mind when you don't perceive the object of the kāma, but if the vasana is still there, then when the object returns, the kāma will too. So to actually remove kāma from the mind doesn't mean simply distracting the mind from objects that it could desire, but it means actually changing the programming in the psyche such that even when you see those objects, that same desire doesn't arise for them. So that's essentially what this discussion is about. So how that's shown is given here in a citation from the 6th canto of the Bhagavatam. So let me read a translation of this verse. It says, those sins, that is sins both mild and severe, and contextually it just means sins in general, are destroyed by those austerities, charities, rites, and so forth. That is, by conventional forms of austerity, etc. So this could refer to what you call atonement or prayaschita, or to other forms of pious activity or means by which it is said that one can free oneself of sin, as described in the Dharma, Karma Shastras and so forth. So here, the Bhagavatam, however, points out that the sins, you can destroy the sins, meaning you can counteract the future reaction that may come from those sins. But, quote, the heart thereof, produced by a dharma, is not destroyed just by doing austerity or charity or what have you. That too, meaning the heart of those sins, is destroyed only by service to the feet of Isha. So the, quote, heart of the sin is destroyed only by bhakti, not by tapasya, austerity, vairagya, etc. So what's interesting here is what we find in Sridhar Samipad's commentary on the verse. So I'll just read a little bit. He says, Sri Sridhar Samipad explains that the heart of sins mentioned in this verse refers to the subtle form thereof, which is known as the samskara form they don within the subconscious mind. So here samskara is synonymous with vasana mentioned above. So Sridhar Samipad further explains that it is only as a result of the dissipation of this vasana for sin that purity of heart, meaning the removal of kāma, comes about. So the point made here in Srimad Bhagavatam, there's an error, is that it is only bhakti to Sri Bhagavan that can purify the heart of the vasana for kāma and thus of kāma itself. And the implication of this is that various forms of mere renunciation, devoid of bhakti, cannot purify the heart of this vasana, but only assist in helping a sadhaka endure and minimize the effects of this vasana for a certain period of time. So another analogy that's given is like weeds or unwanted plants. You can cut them back, but they grow back. Unless you eradicate them, in other words, unless you pull them out by the root, they're not really gone. So bhakti can eradicate the sin. It can remove the vasana that gives rise to the propensity to sin by creating a stronger vasana for bhakti, or a non-sinful vasana. But austerities, renunciation, etc., this can only cut the grass, so to speak, or it can only temporarily neutralize or minimize the effect of this vasana, but it doesn't actually get it out. So this is the main distinction. Here it's clearly stated in the Bhagavatam and is the intent of the poet in this verse. So now, a little bit of analysis about what he mentions in the verse as examples of these methods that don't eradicate the vasana for sin. So the first phrase, kāṣāyān bhojanādi-niyamān, is a little bit strange because I have two sources I'm using for the Rasarangita Tika, and interestingly, the two sources have different text regarding this particular section. And it's probably one of the only times I'm seeing such a big difference between the two versions of the commentary, but they give two distinct interpretations of the phrase. So perhaps both interpretations were originally there. It's hard to say. In any case, I'm sharing them both because they both seem worth mentioning. So in one way, one interpretation is that it's two separate items. Kāṣāyāt is one item and bhojanādi-niyamān is another. So if it's read that way, then kāṣāyāt means to wear saffron cloth, which essentially means to wear the garb of a renunciate, to dress and live as a monk. And in that case, then bojanādi-niyamān, or rules regarding one's eating, the implication being one's sleeping, one's other daily habits and behaviors, refers to eating a fixed quantity of food, or drinking types of bitter juice, or not eating palatable foods, or following various types of strictures and self-discipline. This is one way it's interpreted. Or the other interpretation, which seems a little less likely, but nevertheless is given in one version, is that it's rendered as one concept and interpreted to mean that following regulations on one's eating, such as drinking astringent juices that reduce virility. So perhaps some, groups of monks engage in such behavior. And then living in the forest refers to living in a sattvic environment where triggers for kāma, in other words, where objects, where when seen that when one has the vasana, then the desire arises, where one isolates oneself from perception of those objects, and thus, so to speak, neutralizes or creates an absence of the effect of the vasana by isolation. Then exposition refers to teaching texts which speak critically and harshly of kāma, such as the commentator gives the example of the Shanti Shatakam, which is a poem which gives a stark analysis of the consequences of behavior inspired by kāma, and vividly analyzes the futile effects that it has. Other similar texts would be like the Vairagya Shatakam of Bhartrihari, so to remember the temporary nature of material existence, the flickering, fleeting nature of pleasures, the inevitable flip side of suffering that they produce, these kind of things. Another example of this type of literature might be like the Mohamudgara of Shankaracharya Pad and things like this. So these texts can give knowledge about the negative effects of acting upon kāma, or of fostering kāma within the mind, such that one can feel a sense of resolve and conviction of not acting upon those desires. But even if one has that knowledge, it doesn't mean that one can actually successfully resist those desires, or that the vasana for those desires is removed. And as we hear in the Gita, that gyan, or knowledge, can be overridden by kāma. This is stated in the 3rd chapter when Arjuna asks Krishna, why do people sin as if by force? Then Krishna says that kāma is the cause, and kāma has the power to cover over, or gyan becomes, quote, avrita, or covered by the power of kāma. So while such knowledge is not without utility, it's not also a complete means in and of itself. Then he says, sages' rites. So this means vows of silence, vows of itinerancy, other types of ways of isolating oneself such that one doesn't involve oneself with or further foster attachment to various objects of kāma. So these can check one from acting upon the impulses of kāma, can isolate or limit the extent to which kāma becomes triggered in the mind, all of these things. So they have some partial utility, but they don't actually remove the vasana for kāma from the mind, and therefore they don't actually purify the mind of kāma, and therefore they're not actually complete or fail-safe means. So the second half of the verse contrasts all of these things with bhakti. So it's and not just generally, but strongly, by saying not just bhakti in general, but, quote, even a slight touch of an undertaking of worship of the lotus feet of Govinda can destroy kāma outright. So what all of these other things can't do in profusion, even a little bit of this can do in completion. This is the contrast. And the commentator draws out what's called a kaimutya-nyaya from this statement, saying that even a slight touch of worship can destroy kāma, then a greater quantity of worship can do so even more, constancy in worship can do so even more, and worship on the path of raga can do so the most of all. So this is an allusion to statements in the Bhakti Sandarbha, where Jiva Goswami explains that the path of Raganuga is far more powerful than the path of Vaidhi, which by implication means far more powerful than the path of Gyan, because acts that are performed, or rather, let me say again, because there's nothing more powerful to focus and absorb and make the mind one-pointed than desire. And if one's desire is for bhakti, one's desire is for something that is one's paramartik lakshya, one's aim in the absolute sense, then nothing will motivate and fix the mind more so upon that object, such that one's samskara for that spiritual object becomes all the more fortified, and the vasanas for all other things become all the more withered. So this is the implication. And then a little detail is given. Why does the commentator not just say bhakti to Bhagavan in general? Not the commentator, the poet. And rather he refers to worship of this Govinda who is playing extraordinarily on the bountiful banks of the daughter of Mount Kalinda. So the Yamuna Devi is known to have appeared from Mount Kalinda. So she's known as the daughter of Mount Kalinda. So what this refers to is the Rasa Leela and Krishna's play with the gopis, or this extraordinary play that he performed with the gopis on the bank of the Yamuna. So by referring to the Rasa Leela specifically in reference to the idea of destroying kāma, then what this points to is a very well-known verse which comes at the end of the Rasa Panchadhyayi, or the 5 chapters about the Rasa Leela in the Bhagavatam, where this very same point is made. So vikrīḍatam vrajabhadubiridam cha Vishnu, this well-known statement. I have a translation here as follows. one endowed with conviction or shraddha, who shall hear about or describe this extraordinary play and so forth of Vishnu with the ladies of Braja, attains superlative bhakti to Bhagavan, quickly casts off the heart disease of kāma, and without delay becomes steadfast. So this verse has a number of interesting points in the commentaries on it by Jiva Goswami, Vishwanath Chakravarti, and others. If you could give at least one whole class on those commentaries, if not multiple classes. So I'm not going to go into elaborate analysis of that at this time. And just make one point that there are also two different ways of reading the verse, whether the statement at the very end, that dhira, is taken to be the agent of the activity, or taken to be, or you take it that there's an implied passive verb qualifying that word dhira, and thus it's part of the predicate. Grammatically, both interpretations are possible. And I've given it one way, but it's not the only way that it can be given. And the way I've given it is the way it's given by Chakravarti Pad, and in one case by Jiva Goswami Pad, as well as it's given by Kaviraj Goswami Pad in the Chaitanya Charitamrita. So that's just one point I'll make. But the only point that I'm raising from all of these points is something which is perhaps a little lesser known, because it's not in any of the Bhagavatam commentaries, but in a lesser known text called the Radha Krishna Archan Deepika of Jiva Goswami, where he also cites this verse. And there he makes a comment which he doesn't make in the Vaishnava Toshani or the Krama Sandarbha or the other places in the Sandarbhas where he cites this, where he specifically mentions that this description of the result of hearing about this lila, that it leads to this quick removal or this quick destruction of kāma, he says that is dependent upon the eligibility of the listener. In other words, it won't be so quick, or it may not be quick at all, if someone doesn't have the necessary eligibility. And in fact, it can even be detrimental when that eligibility is lost, or when one never had it in the first place. So this statement is not, so to speak, a universal statement that applies to all equally to the same extent, but rather it presupposes that the quote, one endowed with conviction who shall hear about and describe this play has the requisite eligibility to hear about it in the appropriate manner. So in other words, it requires a certain degree of strength of faith, a certain degree of education, a certain degree of existing purity of mind in order to hear these things in such a way that it leads to the greater purification. And if that fundamental purity of mind, conviction, and education is not there, then you won't see the effects described here. This is the point. So, seeing this in light of this comment of Jiva Goswami, if we look back at the verse we're discussing now, when it says that, quote, even a slight touch of an undertaking of worship of the lotus feet of Govinda as he's playing on the bank of the Yamuna, indicates that a slight undertaking will initiate this process of purification of the mind, no doubt. But exactly how far it will go and exactly how fast it will go depend upon the relative eligibility of the person. In other words, if the person's already quite purified, then it'll happen quicker. If the person's starting from a less purified state, it'll happen much slower. The analogy given elsewhere in the Bhakti Sandarbha is like a piece of wood logged with water. A piece of very dry wood, if you light it on fire, it burns quickly. A piece that's waterlogged won't burn hardly at all, even if you subject it to the same fire. So it depends upon the existing state of the psyche of the individual, exactly how far or how fast these things will be described. So when the verse says that one will quickly cast off the disease of the heart and without delay become steadfast, then that is true, but it's true of a particular bearer of eligibility, not necessarily of one and all. But of course, one of the main points is that it's trying to stress that this is a highly beneficial, highly powerful practice, and that one will do well to engage in it according to one's eligibility, and primarily by hearing such lila from someone who can present it to one according to one's existing level of capacity to receive. So, like this verse conveys this point, that which arises in the mind, or kāma, is not destroyed by any type of austerity or knowledge or renunciation, but is by taking to the path of bhakti, and especially by taking to the path of Krishna bhakti, especially to the path of Raganuga bhakti. This, we can say, is the gist of what is conveyed in the verse. So, let's see, I think we have time for one more. So that verse describes the greatness of bhajan with respect to destroying kāma, or the effects of past sins. So now, however, the point is brought up that removing sin should not be one's purpose for practicing bhakti. In other words, if you hear, oh, if I practice bhakti, I can free myself from kāma, so I'll practice bhakti to free myself from kāma. Not like that. In other words, bhakti's purpose is another thing. It's not just a tool or a thing you use to clean yourself. And actually, by using it merely for that purpose, you disrespect it, as we'll see in the commentary. So the verse that we'll discuss now clarifies this point. So let's come to the verse. Alam iyameva praninam patakanam nirasana-viṣaye Krishna Krishneti vane yadi bhavati mukunde bhaktir-ānanda-sāndrā vilutati charanabje mokṣa-sāmrājya-lakṣmīḥ. Krishna Krishna. This statement is certainly enough, more than enough, for the purpose of eradicating the sins of living beings, and thus need not be evoked merely for this purpose. If intensely blissful bhakti to Mukunda manifests, even the goddess of the complete sovereignty of moksha rolls at one's lotus feet, begging to be accepted. So the meaning here is twofold, and it's based on two different senses that the word alam can convey. So the word alam, one meaning of it is enough, or it conveys an idea of sufficiency, equivalent to the way in colloquial Bengali or modern vernacular languages people say boss. You know, if something's enough, if someone's trying to give them too much of something, they say boss, enough, no more, that's plenty. This is one way that the word is used in classical language in Sanskrit. Or sometimes to conclude what one is saying, you'll see writers, sometimes they'll conclude ityalam, means, that's enough. In other words, I've made the point, I don't need to elaborate further, ityalam. So the first interpretation is based on that by saying the name Krishna, to purify sin, ityalam. This is plenty, this is more than enough. The name is so purifying that chanting it even twice is more than enough to purify oneself of sin. However, so that's one interpretation. So in that interpretation, it's stressing the power of the name of Krishna, or the power of the practice of bhakti known as nama-kirtan, to purify sin. So in that way, the greatness of bhajan is illustrated by that interpretation. The second interpretation is perhaps more important, and is based on a different interpretation, or a different way of reading the word alam. So the second sense of alam is that of prohibition, or varana. Just as if a child is doing something it ought not be doing, the parent might say, "That's enough." In other words, it means stop, don't do that anymore. So alam can convey that sense. So read in that way, the verse isn't translated as follows. Krishna, Krishna. This statement should not be employed, should certainly not be employed for the purpose of eradicating the sins of living beings. In other words, don't do that. Don't use that anymore. So the commentator gives an interesting analogy. He says that, how is this enough or not to be done? He says it's like giving capital punishment to someone for killing an insect. And literally the word tushanal is the word the commentator uses, which I had to look it up, is some type of classical village form of capital punishment where bundles of straw are wrapped around the body and then lit on fire, such that the straw, ignites quickly and the person is killed by the fire. So this is a form of capital punishment called tushanal. So he's saying that if you apply, such an extreme punishment as that to someone for such a tiny crime, that's an offense. Actually, that's an offense even to the wrongdoer, or you're not being just in using such an overreach. So similarly, the name is something so powerful. It's powerful the way capital punishment is powerful. It's like the ultimate power. And to use that on such a tiny thing as a sin is actually an aparad against the name, because that's not what it's meant for. The purpose of chanting the name is not merely for that purpose. So there's a statement which says this in the Bhagavatam itself. So, quote, this is verse 6.3.24. And it also is based on the same word alam, which is used by the author in this poem. So it says, Sankirtan of the names, acts, and qualities of Bhagavan should not be thus employed for the purpose of eradicating the sins of a living being. And, if you look out there, some translations of this verse say the opposite, say that the names should be chanted to eradicate the sins of living beings. But if you read Sridhar Swami's commentary, you read the works of the other commentators, although it's possible to translate the verse that way because the word alam has different meanings, none of the commentators use that meaning of the word alam. Rather, they use the prohibitive sense of the word alam, which is the sense that our commentator here is citing the verse in consonance with the interpretation he's giving of this verse. So that's why I've translated it in this way, and that, as far as I can tell, seems to be the unanimous viewpoint of Sridhar Swami, Chakravarti Pad, etc. So it's a little unfortunate that there may be some translation floating out there saying the opposite. Anyhow, it should be clear from this analysis that to use the name merely for the purpose of committing sin is an offense against the name. This is the point. So then the commentator adds that the verse, it uses the word alam twice. So by saying it twice, what's the implication of saying it twice? He says the implication is that not only can it purify you of whatever sin you want to purify yourself of, but it can purify you of any sin that anyone can ever commit. So he cites another verse which is given in Hari Bhakti Vilas that states this exact thing. Nam nasya yavati shakti papa nir harane hare tavad kartum nashaknoti patakam pataki janam. A sinful person is not able to commit sin to the extent that this name of Hari has the power to eradicate sin. So you can't commit as much sin as the name has the power to purify sin. In other words, the name is more purifying than you can ever be wicked. Your tiny ability to be bad will always fall short or prove smaller than the name or Bhagavan's capacity to be good or to be purifying. So this is this is happy news. This is an important point. So the name is of such potency. This is the point being stressed. And our commentator, he quotes another part of Sridhar Swami's commentary in this same section of the Bhagavatam, which is nice, where it says that he gives this analogy saying that a wild lion, or the king of the jungle, is not engaged to ward off dogs and jackals. Similarly, the name is not employed merely for the relatively minor task of eradicating sin. So in other words, you don't, use excessive force, or you don't use something excessively great when a small thing can do the same job. In other words, it's not that difficult to scare away a dog. You don't need a lion to do that. Similarly, to remove sin, there are many ways to remove sin. You don't need the name to do that. The name is something so powerful, so great. And moreover, it's not meant to be used merely for that purpose. So this is why. So he says that, quote, "Therefore, is such bhakti fit to be employed for the purpose of the eradication of sin? No. When it is, a great transgression occurs as a result of the occurrence of bhakti's being disrespected." So to engage bhakti, not for the sake of pleasing Bhagavan, but merely for the sake of trying to absolve yourself of your own wrongdoing, that's a disrespect to bhakti. That's an offense. So, although the name has this power to purify, it doesn't mean we should try to use it for that purpose. So, the second half of the verse illustrates how the effects of bhakti, represented by the mention of the effect of chanting the name of Krishna, do not culminate merely in eradicating sin. So what is the greater power of bhakti? How is that shown? It says, if intensely blissful bhakti to Mukunda manifests, that is, if one has bhakti imbued with an intensity of bliss as a result of direct experience of Sri Bhagavan, then the goddess of the complete sovereignty of moksha, that is, the fortune of the attainment of the foremost among the four Purusharthas, rolls at one's feet and begs, "Please accept me." And so the commentator gives a citation which is given in the Sindhu to illustrate this, saying, quote, "All siddhis headed by mukti and all astonishing enjoyments are maid-servant-like followers of the great goddess of Hari Bhakti." There's also a similar statement of Bilvamangal Thakur in the Krishna Karnamrita, where it describes that moksha comes like a maidservant to the bhakta. So this phrase, this quote, "the goddess of complete sovereignty," this is some classical literary expression in Sanskrit, Swarajya-lakṣmīḥ, which is used in many cases to refer to something that is considered to be of utmost value. So if the name, in the classical sense of what is considered the ultimate Purushartha moksha, has the power to grant you moksha, then what's the big deal if it can purify you of a few sins? It can purify you of, it can free you from the entirety of samsara. So when it has such greatness, such power, to use it for such a meager purpose is actually a disrespect to its greatness. This is what is meant to be conveyed. And furthermore, bhakti's purpose is for the service of Bhagavan, the pleasure of Bhagavan, to use it, essentially to try to use it for one's own interest merely, in the primary sense, will not be befitting. So this is what is conveyed by this verse. So on the one hand, the verse is indicating or assuring that that chanting the name of Bhagavan is extremely purifying of sin. That's one thing to learn. But secondly, that we ought not engage in bhakti, or we ought not use the name or try to use the name merely for the purpose of purifying ourselves. Rather, we should remember that bhakti is of such power it can produce all of the Purusharthas, and beyond that, it can produce the fifth Purushartha, or the ultimate Purushartha, Krishna Prem, which is the very next topic, which comes here in Padyavali. the prema saubhagya, or the fortune of Krishna Prem, is the next prakaran, which starts with the following verse. So we'll come to that in the next discussion. So this concludes the discussion of the section called Bhajana Mahatmya, or the greatness of bhajan. So its importance has been shown, it's how it's purifying of sin, it's purifying of kāma, it's essential to every act of dharma, it's essential to the attainment of liberation, and it's most worthy or most fit to be performed by virtue of the worshipability of its recipient, Bhagavan. All of these points have been made in this section. So I'll conclude here for today, and if we're so blessed, we'll get on to the next section, Prema Saubhagya, which has 2 very nice verses in it, in our next discussion. So if anyone wants to comment or question anything, feel free at this time, if the line holds. All right, then we'll conclude here. Vaishnavebhyo namo namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.